Across this series of Curveball, you've heard from leaders from many different sectors: sports, the arts, small business, multinationals. We've heard their stories, warts and all, the good times, but also those tricky leadership moments when things aren't going so well, or when a company's been hit by a curveball they couldn't see coming. And I guess if I was to reflect on just one common trait these leaders have demonstrated, it's the ability to change direction. But making fast decisions to pivot quickly requires something that leaders of, say, 30 years ago may not have had. And that's the ability to rethink your own decisions. We used to look for leaders to deliver a clear vision and long-term strategy, and then we looked to them to consistently guide us on that path. But now, well, today's most successful leaders don't always know the answers. And at the risk of sounding like Donald Rumsfeld, they also know that they don't know the answers, which makes it easier to shift focus. Like when you're not fixed in your thinking about your own plan, you can more easily change your strategy to meet a new challenge.
What I'm looking for in a leader is not certainty, it's competence. And part of competence is being a good learner. Part of being a good learner is changing your mind when you discover that some of your past knowledge no longer applies to the present world.
So today, something a little different. World-renowned organisational psychologist Adam Grant on the power of rethinking your own assumptions in a world that's ever-changing. I'm Kelly Reardon, and on Curveball, we go deep and we get specific with some of the boldest leaders who faced challenging times. We've heard from Virgin Australia's CEO Paul Scurrah, who watched on as his entire fleet of aircraft was grounded overnight. And there was Jeremy Fleming, who pivoted from creating sets and stages to making flat-pack desks when the live event industry shut down. And we were all hoping that Adore Beauty's Kate Morris would mount a successful IPO float of her company during lockdown after bootstrapping herself to a risky high-growth strategy many years on from when she was sitting in her garage packing boxes of cosmetics. We've been hearing these stories of courage in leadership.
Basically, it was just like, right, chips all in on the table, knowing that if this did not work or if we didn't raise money in time, I was going to lose everything.
If I lose a bit of hope or they see that I'm not as on my game, I think that has a ripple effect through the organisation. So it doesn't become an act. It just becomes a mindset that says, I can't pretend to be in control. I have to be. That's another curveball that's been thrown at us. So we have to find a different way.
And it's really made me think about what leadership looks like in 2021. It doesn't look like a boss who comes up with a 10 or 15-year strategy and then drives it along with little adaptation. Adam Grant is one of the world's leading organisational psychologists. He's a complete rock star with companies like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the NBA, and also he's a member of the Defence Innovation Board at the Pentagon. He's the author of several best-selling books, including one with Sheryl Sandberg of Facebook. He also hosts a truly fabulous podcast called Work Life for TED. But he's most at home when teaching and researching, looking deeply at what makes organisations and leaders tick. His new book will have you rethinking the leadership qualities you're cultivating and why questioning your own assumptions and ideas is so valuable. Adam Grant, welcome to Curveball.
Thanks, Kelly. It's great to be here. I look forward to multiple curveballs.
Is it true you're actually a trained magician?
Guilty as charged, although trained as a high bar. I was self-taught. I started when I was 12, and I performed until basically I was 21. I get talked into a show every once in a while, but I haven't really kept up my skills.
Let's hope you have a few magic tricks for us today. What drew you, though, to learning how to do magic tricks?
So I was babysitting for some kids down the street, and they were pretty hyperactive. One day they got into magic tricks, and I noticed they sat still. So I went home in between and I started learning some card tricks, and I really loved entertaining them and trying to surprise them. And I was a shy kid. So being able to do some magic tricks was a little bit of a way to come out of my shell. And I guess I loved creating the element of surprise. And I also really enjoyed the challenge of trying to master something that looked impossible. And I didn't really realize that it would be good practice for one day getting on the TED stage, but I think if I hadn't done magic shows, I never would have gone anywhere near that red circle.
That is so interesting. You faced a curveball quite early on because you'd been training at the elite level in competitive diving.
Also guilty as charged, which was not a sport that I should have necessarily been drawn to because I was afraid of heights and I had no rhythm whatsoever. I could barely touch my toes without bending my knees, but I was just mesmerized watching diving, and I wanted to learn how to do it. And I started way too late. I was 13, and I was lucky to have an incredible coach who said, "I will never cut a diver from the team who wants to be here." And he just poured all of his energy into helping me see more potential in myself than I saw, and then reach that potential. And by the time I went from being a terrible diver when I started to qualifying for the Junior Olympic Nationals and getting recruited to dive at the university level, which I could not believe, but it was it was not something. Looking back, what was I thinking? Why in the world did I hurl myself off a 3-meter springboard and do a full twisting 2.5? That's insane.
This is interesting to me, though. You mentioned your coach and how important he was, and that he said to you, as long as you turn up, that's enough for me. But he also said to you, you don't have any of the makings of being a diver.
Yeah, Eric told me that diving required explosive power, flexibility, and grace. And I couldn't jump. I basically walked like Frankenstein, and I didn't have any real control. So that was the bad news. But he also said on my first day of practice that, diving is a sport where it doesn't attract the world's best athletes unless you're in China, right? So it attracted all the people who were too short for basketball and too slow for track and too weak for rugby or football. And if I worked really hard at diving, I could become a good diver. And that just lit a fire under me.
And then how did you go about rethinking your identity later on when you'd been training so hard? You were very focused. I think this is a theme for you already, how disciplined you are. But there were, problems or issues that came later with diving that meant you had to completely flip your thinking on who you were.
Yeah, I was obsessed. I remember when a friend of mine ran into my uncle one day. He said, "Hey, Adam's about to graduate from high school and go to college. What do you think he's going to major in?" My uncle said, "Diving." And it was my identity. It was who I was. And when I got to the college level, I found out that I couldn't beat people who are more talented than me by working harder than them anymore. Because most people at that level were extremely talented and extremely hardworking. And I had to grapple with this very difficult decision of, should I walk away from this sport that has given me a chance to pursue excellence and mastery, which has allowed me to feel a sense of belonging as part of a team, to have something of value to add to that team, to have knowledge to share with younger divers. I love teaching them and coaching them. And also, frankly, a way to accomplish something that impressed people. Like I really, it was similar to magic. I loved being able to do something that other people marveled at, and letting go of that meant I was giving up something that was important to me. And I was leaving not only a sport that I loved, but also something that I was good at behind.
This is a bit of a curveball moment for you, and I'm wondering if there were questions that you asked yourself in that moment that guided your thinking, or mentors that you sought counsel from.
Yeah, so my coach Eric Best had this brilliant strategy for getting me to try new dives when I was afraid. And I thought I was afraid of heights. I actually realize now that I was afraid of falling and getting lost and getting hurt. And when it came time to try something new, I would just stand there on the end of the board, freezing, shaking. And sometimes I would be up there for 15 or 20 minutes, just not doing anything. And eventually Eric asked me, Adam, are you going to do this dive ever? I'd say, yeah, of course. This is a major goal for me. I know it's a milestone. And he'd say, okay, well, what are you waiting for? Why don't you get it out of the way? And I found myself coming back to that when I thought about quitting diving. I asked a similar question, which was, am I going to stop diving one day competitively? And the answer was yes. And then I realized, what am I waiting for? I had already exceeded all my goals. I was continuing to dive at this point just because it was something I did. It was who I was. It was something that I had always loved. But that didn't mean I had to compete and train many hours a week to try to push myself further in the sport. And I think I had to recognize I was never going to make the Olympics. And I'd already gotten to a level that I would have been very proud of if I had known when I first started that I could get that good. And I should be satisfied with that.
And then there was this lecture that you went to sort of early on, I think, at university, when Richard Hackman sort of transformed your thinking then on what you did want to do with your life. How? What did he say that changed your direction?
Wow, you have done your homework, Kelly.
I try.
Impressive. I'm going to try to say some things you don't already know today.
Good.
We'll see if I succeed.
Please.
Well, I was a psychology major with no idea how to apply that to a career. I knew I didn't have the patience to be a therapist. I knew I was too squeamish for medical school to be a psychiatrist. And I was having a hard time halfway through university trying to figure out what kind of career should I even consider. And then I signed up for this organizational psychology class, and Richard Hackman came in on the first day and said, I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. And I realized that in organizational psychology, my job could be to study all the jobs I thought were interesting. And he ended up becoming the world's leading expert on team effectiveness. And he studied that in all these fascinating places. He loved music, so he studied what made a symphony orchestra great. He was interested in flying, so he studied the effectiveness of airline cockpit crews. He was drawn to intelligence work, so he studied a bunch of major international intelligence agencies to try to figure out how they could collaborate more effectively. And all of a sudden, for me, something clicked. And I said, oh, that sounds like a job I want. My job could be to fix other people's jobs. And I cannot think of a more interesting job, because I've gotten to study astronauts and Hollywood screenwriters and firefighters, and more than the interesting worlds they live in, I've gotten to learn from all these people. And I feel like if I don't love my job, it's my own fault, because I designed it.
You really hate that question, what do you want to be when you grow up? Which is a question, we ask our kids, and we were asked when we were young. Why is that the wrong question?
It's a cruel question. It's punishment. It's brutal. I felt every time I was asked that question as a kid, I felt like I was disappointing someone, because I didn't have some grand heroic aspiration. I just didn't know. And, looking back, I think one of the problems with that question is it encourages kids to define themselves in terms of work. When you're asked, who do you want to be? You can't say, I want to be a great dad or a good person who leads a life of integrity and generosity, right? You have to name a career. And I think, locking kids into a career as their identity before they even know what jobs are out there and what interests they might develop and what skills they can master, it's just way too soon. So one of the things we do with our kids is, instead of saying, what do you want to be? We ask them, what are all the different things that you like to do or that you're interested in learning more about? Way less pressure. You can define yourself in terms of curiosities and in terms of experiments, as opposed to saying, all right, I got to figure out the career identity that I'm going to carry with me for the next 3 decades.
In terms of leaders and companies, why is rethinking a quality that is so important now?
Well, I think 2020 forced us all to do a lot of rethinking, right? We had to question assumptions that we've taken for granted for most of our lives. Can I eat? Is it safe to eat indoors in a restaurant? Can I hug people who aren't in my COVID bubble? Can I possibly get any work done when I have 3 kids doing online school on Zoom at the same time? And I think that, my hope is moving forward that we'll all start to do more intentional, more proactive rethinking, where we don't wait until we're dragged kicking and screaming into questioning some of our opinions and our knowledge and our decisions. But we actually do that as a free choice. And, as an example of that, Kelly, in 2018, I went to a bunch of the most powerful CEOs in Silicon Valley. And I said, hey, there's some new evidence coming from a call center in China, C-Trip, that when people are randomly assigned to work from home, they're 13.5% more productive, and they're half as likely to quit over the next 6 months. And I would love to build on that and just see what's the optimal amount of remote work and how do we structure it? So could we run, for example, a remote Friday experiment where people get 1 day a week to work from anywhere, and we track the impact on productivity, creativity, collaboration? And all those CEOs said, no, thank you.
Because they don't trust their staff? Like, what was it about? What was their reason?
I think that was part of it. I think, there were some leaders who said, I can't really micromanage people from a distance. And I'm like, well, what does
Maybe
that say
about
your management or your hiring decisions? But I think for a lot of them, they were worried that the culture was going to fall apart, or that, once they opened Pandora's box, they couldn't close it again. And it was going to create all these disparities where, some people by virtue of their jobs or their status could work from anywhere and others wouldn't be able to, and they'd have to deal with all these equity and fairness issues. But, I said, look, part of running a successful organization is being a learning organization. And that means you have to be open to trying experiments and set expectations with your teams that some of the things you try may not work, and you're hoping to find out what does. And I look back on that and think, if they had been a little bit more open to experimenting, they would have had all of 2018 and 2019 to figure out how to make remote work when we weren't dealing with the fear of getting a deadly disease, and we weren't trying to juggle all these extra responsibilities with our kids at home. So it seems like a big missed opportunity for rethinking for me. And Kelly, I think that this is what most of us do. We do our rethinking in hindsight, right? We kick ourselves and say, oh, I should have rethought that career path, or I should have reconsidered that big leadership decision I made. And I would like to see more of us do more of our rethinking upfront.
In the height of the pandemic, I was still working at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. I'd been running a team there for a number of years. And one of the bosses said to my leadership group at one point, how's everyone going sort of in this working from home thing? And, are people getting work done, was essentially the question. And I said, it's exactly the same as in the workplace, which is the people who are driven and motivated and have intrinsic motivation and don't need direction, they're just getting on with it like they always do, like they did in the office. And the people who tend to kind of slack off from time to time or don't turn their work in on time in the office are still doing that at home as well. It's not about where the person is physically. It's about the person's style and the way that they operate, surely.
Yeah, I think there's so much to that. And one of the interesting things that came out of that Nick Bloom C-Trip experiment that I mentioned earlier is part of the reason that people were more productive when they were working from home was they didn't get distracted as much by their coworkers. They weren't dealing with constant interruptions, and they didn't have all this commute time. So they were able to redirect that toward getting things done. But part of it was also that they were less likely to take unnecessary breaks. And we think that's in part because they appreciated the loyalty, right? You can't expect people to act trustworthy if you don't show them trust. And the fact that management was saying, hey, you know what? We know you care about doing a good job. We're going to let you figure out the best time and place to do that, meant that they were really earning loyalty, and people were grateful for that freedom.
Adam Grant, who's doing a good job of rethinking? Can you give us an example of an organisation that you've studied that does a great job of rethinking things?
I guess the place I would start is with Ray Dalio's hedge fund, Bridgewater. I think they've been the most successful hedge fund in the history of the industry. They warned their clients about an impending financial crisis in 2007. And they have a lot of unusual practices that may or may not be a fit for a particular organization or industry. But one of the core principles at Bridgewater is that no one has the right to hold a critical opinion without speaking up about it. And that is the opposite of what I see in most workplaces. And they make that real in a bunch of interesting ways. One is, as a new hire, during onboarding, you're introduced on an iPad to Bridgewater's core principles. But as you go through each one, you're asked, do you agree? And you're invited from day one to challenge. If you can point out that one of the principles is incomplete, that two are inconsistent, or that something else is missing, they will actually revise their principles based on your day one feedback.
I'd be worried there's a trapdoor and you you fall through it if you answer that incorrectly.
Yeah, it sounds like an Austin Powers moment, doesn't it? But they're not doing it in the James Bond villain sense. What they're doing is they're saying, we want you to have a dissenting voice from day one. We believe the only way we can beat the market is to think differently from everyone else. And the only way we can do that is we can hear from people who aren't drinking the Kool-Aid, who are brand new to the organization and can still hold up a mirror and see our reflection clearly. And then you get into performance reviews and they evaluate you on whether you are challenging people to think differently. So you could be fired for not criticizing your boss's boss. And I think we need more organizations with those kinds of practices.
In that organization, what is the difference between, I guess, constructive criticism, or do they give a framework for how criticism should be delivered? Because that could really easily turn into something quite nasty.
There's a careful selection process to make sure that people can not only dish it out, but take it too. But there's also a lot of training. They go through sort of a Navy SEAL style boot camp in their development process. I think there's a lot that we've learned though about how to get people to be more open to criticism and negative feedback so that they will rethink some of their assumptions. I think one of the first things to do is to ask them if they want feedback. I'm stunned by how rarely this happens, right? Because the moment you just tell somebody what they could do better or what they need to rethink, is the moment that they often feel ambushed or like they're being attacked. And if you say, hey, I had a couple questions or I noticed a few things, I wasn't sure if they might help or not. Are you interested in hearing my feedback? Then most of the time people say yes. And then they've opted into it and it becomes a conversation as opposed to an onslaught.
Very powerful thing to ask someone to, may I just give you some feedback? Are you interested in a couple of things that I've noticed? I'm wondering if we can have a conversation about, like, all of those things are so important, I think. What does rethinking actually require from a leader? Like, what needs to be in the toolkit for a leader to be constantly cultivating that discipline of rethinking and reshaping their views?
Well, I think the first thing you want to watch out for is what's called the hippo effect, which is when hippo stands for the highest paid person's opinion. And as soon as that's known, people want to jump on that bandwagon and they sort of go into politician mode and they try to tell you what you want to hear and campaign and lobby for your approval. One of the ways around that is to actually follow a leader speaks last practice, where you might frame the problem or the topic of discussion in the meeting, but then you say, I want to go around the room and hear from everybody's perspective before I weigh in. And not only does that make it harder for them to cater to you, it also means you're more informed when you do speak and you've benefited from some diversity of thought. So I'd like to see that happen. And I think that it speaks to a more general practice, which is I think every leader knows the value of a support network. You need people who have your back, who encourage you, who cheerlead for you. We also need, though, a challenge network, which is a group of people that we trust to see the holes in our thinking and point out the flaws in our visions and strategies. And one of the things I did, Kelly, after writing Think Again, actually I did it while I was writing Think Again, I should say, I went to a bunch of people who were my most thoughtful critics at different points in my life. And I said, hey, you may not know this, but I consider you a founding member of my challenge network. Then I had to explain what a challenge network is. And I said, I haven't always taken your feedback well. Sometimes I've been defensive or dismissive, but I've always appreciated the fact that you push me and you hold me accountable for doing better. And if you ever have anything that you think could help me improve, don't worry about hurting my feelings. The only way you can hurt my feelings is by not telling me the truth. And I have gotten much better feedback since then.
That required you to be very, very vulnerable, very brave. Can you describe for me how you felt writing those emails or asking for that feedback?
Something that Ray Dalio said to me when I did my very first episode of my work life podcast was at Bridgewater. And I was pushing Ray a little bit on some of his practices. And I said, well, sometimes people don't want to hear criticism. And he said, yeah, but then you care more about your image than your results, and life is better with good results. And the conversation that followed really had a big impact on me, and it crystallized something that I felt for a long time but didn't have the vocabulary to articulate, which is that if I don't do that, if I don't reach out to people and let them know that I want them to challenge me, those people are going to still have the same critical thoughts. I just won't know. And what would you rather? When people have problems with the way that you're working or ideas on how you could be a better leader, would you rather know those things, or would you rather they be secrets? I don't know about you. I'd rather know.
I'm wondering, Adam, if we could debate something for a moment.
Please, bring it on.
Okay.
Have I mentioned that I love to be challenged?
You have. Well, look, I've picked that up from a few of your interviews and a few of your TED Talks. I just thought, I really want to unpack this idea that, leaders need to rethink and should challenge their assumptions and kind of not lead from the front, because I think people look to leaders for certainty. Like, we look to them to make good decisions and to stick with those good decisions. Like, if leaders start changing their mind and switching up their strategy, there is a chance that they'll lose credibility as a leader. So how does that sort of match up with this idea that you also have to be rethinking things?
That's a great question. I have a couple of reactions to it. The first one is to say there's a great story of I think it was the economist John Maynard Keynes, one of the all-time great economists, who reversed a prediction, if I remember the story correctly. And I think it was a reporter who was just mystified and said, well, how in the world could you admit that you were wrong? And he said, well, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do? And it's such a simple way of capturing what I think we should be expecting of leaders, which is to say, look, of course, you shouldn't throw out your organization's entire DNA every 4 days, right? I think we need boundaries around rethinking, but I think most of us do too little of it, not too much. And what I'm looking for in a leader is not certainty, it's competence. And part of competence is being a good learner. Part of being a good learner is changing your mind when you discover that some of your past knowledge no longer applies to the present world, or some of your present predictions aren't going to hold based on how the future is starting to emerge. And I think what I'm looking for, Kelly, in leaders now is confident humility. I think that, we're looking for leadership like Jacinda Ardern models, where she says, look, there's a lot we don't understand about COVID. And we really want to get this right. And so we're going to act with an abundance of caution. But as the science keeps evolving, as our knowledge progresses, we're probably going to make some changes. I saw that another example of that I had a chance to see up close was Adam Silver, the commissioner of the NBA. For anybody who's a basketball fan, Adam was the first professional sports league to halt their season during 2020. And they acted very quickly. And he basically said, look, we don't know what's safe. We don't know what's going to happen. I'm probably going to get a bunch of decisions wrong, but I'm going to err on the side of caution. And I'm not sure what our vision is yet, but I am confident in the team of people that we have to figure it out. And that doesn't erode my confidence in a leader. That builds my trust. That allows me to say, you know what? That's a leader who has the integrity to recognize when he's on a bad path or he's made an error. And instead of digging deeper into that and then kind of doubling down on a bad decision, he's actually going to learn from it and improve based on it. Now, isn't that what you want in a leader? Or are you still worried about a leader being seen as wishy-washy or as a flip-flopper?
I think that you mentioned competence there. We want competence from our leaders. And some of the leaders we've spoken to on this podcast, Paul Scurrah, who was at Virgin Australia, Andrew Stark, who's been trying to single-handedly rescue the World Surf League tour, they've had these moments of pondering the different outcomes or the different paths that they could take. But they also talked about needing to appear certain in front of staff, like having, even in the face of adversity and uncertainty, that actually in front of staff, you need to come across as calm and steady and certain. And so I guess it's balancing, yes, I don't know the answers, I'm trying to work it out, but I appear calm in not knowing as opposed to chaotic in not knowing. Is that the difference?
Oh, I think that's a great distinction. So we're talking here not about certainty of belief or even conviction in a vision, but emotional intelligence, right? Being able to manage what feelings you express in such a way that you don't cause a panic across your organization. And yeah, I think it's a lot easier to say, I'm honestly not sure how we're going to solve this yet. But I'm excited to see where we take this. And, I'm optimistic about our ability to navigate whatever hurdles we encounter. I think that's a very effective way to convey confident humility. I will say, though, Kelly, there are times when I want leaders to show more of that anxiety. One of the mistakes I've seen leaders make over and over again when guiding change, whether they're initiating it or adapting to it in the world around them, is they want to get people hopeful. They want to build optimism and enthusiasm and get people excited about where they're taking, the organization. And that's, number one, that's pretty hard to do during a pandemic, right? When people are anxious and fearful, and it seems a little bit dishonest in some cases to try to rally the troops with your most exuberant vision, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But also there's a risk of complacency. There's a whole body of evidence showing that when leaders talk about all the good things that will happen if we change, that a lot of people don't think they need to change because they already think the status quo is good. And that sometimes what you need to do is you need to convince people that if we don't change, bad things are definitely going to happen. And what that does is it destabilizes the status quo. And it leads them to say, okay, you know what? I don't want those bad things to happen. And so, this change is a little bit uncertain. I'm not sure how it's going to play out, but it's a lot better than being on a sinking ship. And I think in those situations, we do need leaders to show a little bit of anxiety. Now, of course, that's done with confidence, right? That's saying, I am very worried that if we don't make the following changes, we'll be in trouble. But let's talk about why these changes have the potential to rescue us from that trouble.
From Dead Set Studios, this is Curveball, the podcast where top leaders take us inside a pivotal moment for them. It's often a fork in the road or a crucible moment where they're forced to make a bold choice and to deal with a curveball. I'm Kelly Reardon, and organisational psychologist Adam Grant is the host of TED's Work-Life podcast and the best-selling author of Think Again, The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know. We're diving into this idea of leaders needing to rethink and to challenge assumptions and to disrupt the status quo, something so many leaders who've been on Curveball have had to do across the last 12 months in particular. Adam, also leaders, I guess, sometimes surround themselves with like-minded people, other executives who share their vision, share their values. What's the danger in that? Because I know for some people, if you're building a culture, you actually want to have people on board who embody that culture, but that can have some problems too.
Yeah, the danger in that is that you end up with groupthink. There's a great study of tech startups showing that founders who tried to hire and reward and promote people on cultural fit, they were more likely to see their startups survive and go public. But afterward, their startups grew at a slower rate when you tracked metrics like annual market capitalization. And what was happening was early on, they were founded on a bold vision, and they were able to attract a lot of like-minded people to, to run with the vision, to be motivated, to feel a sense of belonging. But then as the organization grew and the world changed, they were weeding out diversity of thought. And my favorite antidote to this is to think, instead of cultural fit, about cultural contribution. To say, okay, of course, we want similarity on a few core values. My read of the data is probably 3 to 5 values that you want to take as critical when you're hiring people and when you're giving them the responsibility and honor of being leaders. But then beyond those core values, everything else you want to ask, not does this person match what's already in our culture, but rather what's missing from our culture, and how do we bring people who will enrich it by offering something that's absent. And that idea of saying we want fit on a few core values and cultural contribution on everything else, I think is a great way to constantly bring in new backgrounds, new perspectives, new kinds of expertise, so that we are open to rethinking the way we've always done things.
In terms of decision making, can we talk about maximisers and satisficers? Because in both my leadership career and also in my personal life, I'm a total maximizer, right? Which is sort of, I know, right? It is great for achieving excellence, but it's probably not so great for having a sane life. So tell us how you distinguish these types of decision makers. I also, of course, classically went straight to, my husband is a satisficer, and this now explains a whole lot of things for me.
Well, try it at your own risk at home. But this is research led by Barry Schwartz and Sheena Iyengar. What they found was that people differ in their decision-making styles. Maximizers, when they're making a decision, they want the best option. Satisficers are more likely to be looking for the good enough option. And when you study people in the job search, for example, maximizers get more job offers. They get 20% higher starting salaries because they're aiming that much higher. They're considering that many more options. But despite doing better, they feel worse. Because happiness, as my friend Tim Urban of Wait But Why often puts it, happiness is just reality minus expectations. And maximizers have extremely high expectations, which means the better job they got, the higher paying job they got, is still far from what they wanted or expected. And they tend to make a lot more social comparisons, because the only way you can really know you got the best is to find out what everyone else got. And there's always someone who's doing better than you. Whereas the satisficers had the wisdom to say, all right, I'm going to set a bar. It's going to be the subjective best, i.e. the best fit for me, not the objective best. And I can set that bar high. And then once I reach it, I'm not going to worry about what other options might have been available or what everybody else got.
The other thing I'm interested in is this idea in Think Again about thinking like a scientist. And you sort of believe that we can fall into these archetypes from time to time, the politician, the preacher and the prosecutor instead. Why is that dangerous, and why should we think like scientists?
I think preaching and prosecuting are dangerous because when we go into preacher mode, we're convinced that we're right. And when we go into prosecutor mode, we're trying to prove everyone else wrong. And in both cases, I don't have to change my mind. You're the one who needs to open yours. In politician mode, we sound a little more flexible, because that's when we're trying to appeal to the hippo, right? We're trying to curry favor or make a good impression on or ingratiate with somebody in power or some audience. But we're usually just telling them what they want to hear. And that doesn't mean we're changing what we really think. We talk like a flip-flopper, essentially. I think the virtue of thinking like a scientist is not about wearing a lab coat or studying your life through a microscope or a telescope, although if you want to do that, be my guest. I think that thinking like a scientist is much more about saying, I want to know what I don't know. I want to doubt some of my existing convictions, and I want to be curious enough to discover new things. And if you do that, right, you recognize that your ideas don't have to be your identity, that when you have a vision or a strategy, that's just a hunch. It's a hypothesis waiting to be tested. And there's evidence that if you go and test it, if you think about running your business like a scientist, you actually get better results. So I think we could all try that on.
Is there still room for gut instinct and for passion? Like, should I mean, I think there's a trend towards leading just with data now and nothing but the science that can also be, I don't know, it can lead you in some tricky places sometimes.
Yeah, I would prefer that leaders are data-driven and evidence-based wherever possible, but a lot of the decisions they have to make just don't have good data yet. I had a fascinating conversation a couple of years ago with Jeff Bezos about whether you love or hate Amazon. He's obviously been a very effective decision maker when it comes to completely transforming the world of e-commerce. And I asked Jeff exactly that question. How do you decide when to wait for the data and when to act? And what I took away from the back and forth we had was he basically pays attention to two conditions. The first one is, how important is the decision? The second one is, how reversible is it? And what I learned was, if a decision is both high stakes and difficult to undo, he will wait as long as possible for all the data that he could possibly gather, because the consequences really matter, and he can't just change his mind in a day. He said the rest of the time, if it's not that important, or if it's easy to reverse, then I'm very happy to just charge forward with the gamble or the experiment. And then I know I can change my mind if I learn it wasn't a good idea. And I thought that 2x2 matrix was a very helpful framework that any leader could apply.
Amazon have this accountability process they go through, this rethinking scorecard. And why does it create a learning culture? What is it about that matrix that means they're constantly trying to learn and relearn?
Well, I don't know how explicitly it's applied, but my vision of a rethinking scorecard is it'll often take years and sometimes decades before you know the results of all your decisions. In the meantime, what you can do is you can pay a little bit, maybe I shouldn't say less attention to outcomes, but you can complement your focus on outcomes with a more thorough consideration of decision processes. So this is another 2x2 that I would draw, where you have the result of a decision, could be successful or failed. Then you have the quality of the decision process. Was it deep or shallow? And you will find that you have some good outcomes based on bad processes. We need to stop rewarding and celebrating those. Those are just luck. And on the flip side, you have some good decision processes that led to bad outcomes. And those ought to be rewarded and celebrated and certainly not punished, because those were intelligent experiments to run.
I'm interested in how this relates to things like the Dunning-Kruger effect, the idea it's actually when we lack competence that we actually come across as overly confident.
Yeah, I worry about that a lot, in part because some of the evidence on the Dunning-Kruger effect shows that the people who are the worst at logical reasoning or score the lowest on emotional intelligence are the most likely to overestimate their strengths in those areas. And I think it happens in part, in some cases because of ego. In some cases, there's a big debate about the statistical analysis showing that effect. But we're pretty confident that at least part of the effect is driven by an inability to know what excellence looks like. And if you lack emotional intelligence, for example, you generally don't have a good sense of what emotional intelligence is. And it's hard for you to judge yourself and others on that dimension. The same is true for logical reasoning or anything else that you might evaluate. And so this goes back to Bridgewater. One of the things that Bridgewater does that I think is helpful here is, instead of just giving people overall performance reviews, they have people rated or dotted in real time during meetings and after different projects are done, but also along the way. And they're dotted on all these different dimensions. And the goal is for people to recognize that they're not equally credible in all domains. So, Kelly, you might want to listen to my expertise on organizational psychology a lot more than if I start to give you opinions about music or chemistry or financial markets or food, which are all areas I know absolutely nothing about. And the thing I worry about with leaders, and especially with founders, is they're told they don't know what they're doing when they bring in a bold idea. It turns out that it's successful, and they overgeneralize from that. And they say, every time people tell me that I'm completely wrong or crazy, that means I'm right and they're wrong. And that is Dunning-Kruger in action, and we need to shield against that.
The other thing that completely floored me in your book is the idea that in high performance cultures, we become attached to best practice when we shouldn't. And I sort of think best practice principles actually help people unite behind a standard, which can still be iterated and improved, but it sort of stops staff going rogue and making up concepts and principles that are scattergun or that, haven't been tested. Do you agree?
Sort of. I think I partially agree and I partially disagree. I agree that it's better to have best practices than haphazard practices. I think it's good to have a high bar or a high standard. I think though that
it's sort of an agreed. It's sort of sorry to jump in there, but it's like an agreed foundation, isn't it? Why I like best practice is sort of like this is an agreed playground or sandpit that we operate in that looks like this. And that actually, I think, then gives people permission to sort of break rules a little bit. But it's like the underpinning foundation is there.
I think that's interesting. And I could be persuaded by that. I think I'd love to see more data on this. But one of the things that worries me about best practices, and I think this is especially true in high reliability industries. I've seen it at NASA, for example. I've seen it in hospitals. Places where the consequences of error are catastrophic, is that once a practice becomes best, it's like it's frozen in stone, and nobody has the freedom to question it anymore because this is already our best practice. How could we possibly change it? There's nothing better than best. And so for me, this is a framing question. I just wonder, could we get the upsides without the downsides if we said we're looking for better practices? And does that create more of a mindset of continuous improvement as opposed to suggesting there's an endpoint? And once we call a practice best, we can stop rethinking it.
Adam Grant, I think you are one of the most well-known speakers in the globe at the moment. TED Talks, speaking with people on stage all the time, whether it's Esther Perel, Sheryl Sandberg. But as I understand it, you weren't always that interested in public speaking.
I mean, I would say not only was I not interested, I was doing everything I could to avoid it.
So how did you overcome that fear? Because that's a curveball as well. Like, I'm not good at public speaking, but I kind of have to be because I'm a professor. How did you overcome that?
Well, I'm still working on it. I think, knowing the material helps. Knowing my audience helps. Maybe even more than that, it's really hard for the body physiologically to produce anxiety 2, 3, 4 hours a day, every day. And so I guess I put myself through a version of exposure therapy. It's called flooding, right? Where, instead of doing systematic desensitization, where, let's say you're afraid of spiders, we'd first have you draw a picture of a spider, then look at real spiders on the internet. Then we'd put a spider in a room in a cage far away from you, and we'd slowly warm you up. Flooding is the opposite. It's like, you know what? We're just going to put a spider on your arm. You're going to discover it's not a poisonous spider. You didn't die. And then, maybe you get used to it a little bit. And that's what I did with public speaking. I started volunteering to give guest lectures in my friends' classes when I was in grad school. I basically forced myself to get on stage as often as I could. And I found that, that sometimes the butterflies would show up and other times they wouldn't. And it really depended a lot on whether I was comfortable with what I was trying to share and I understood who I was trying to reach. And so I've tried to be as prepared as I can be.
What's been the most unexpected challenge you've faced? Like something that's knocked you off the path?
When I was finishing grad school, I was getting ready to interview for jobs at different universities to teach. And I had gone to grad school thinking, I'm really interested in research, but what I love is sharing knowledge. And, I want to try to pay forward all the incredible things I've learned from my favorite teachers. And I went and interviewed for my first job and I didn't get it. And I was told it was because during my interview, they were convinced, this business school was convinced that I could not handle their MBA students. That I wasn't knowledgeable enough, I wasn't confident enough, I wasn't entertaining enough, just I wasn't cut out for it. It was sort of devastating. And I guess what happened after that was I had a mentor, Jane Dutton, who said, Adam, she actually watched me give a practice talk. after that. And she said, Adam, you have to unleash your inner magician. And it's something I think about all the time now, Kelly, because I had gotten locked into this mode of, okay, I have to deliver a bunch of information. And so I'm going to memorize my script and I'm going to do it in, the most matter of fact way possible. And I was losing the element of surprise. I had no playfulness. I was failing to engage the audience because I was just trying to get through my content. And I think about this all the time. Whenever I get on stage, I think, okay, unleash my inner magician. What does that mean? That means I am thrilled to astonish the audience with something that surprised me before I knew, what I'm about to share. I am here to make them think and also hopefully to make them laugh. And I also am, I'm open. There might be some hecklers in the audience. And instead of being afraid of those people, I'm going to make them part of the show. And I'm going to think through what their challenges might be and figure out how to bring them in on the fun. And that, just completely reframed for me what it meant to teach and to speak in front of an audience. And it's been helpful ever since.
Just finally, I took a huge leap to quit my job of nearly 20 years in a big bureaucracy in the middle of the pandemic to create my own company. And I've therefore had to unlearn lots of things and learn new things. And I've found that the way I make decisions has changed, because in a large organisation, you're making decisions, sure, about the customers and the audience, but also really to line up with a larger strategy or to align with stakeholders or to fit some sort of systemic issue. But now I'm making many more smaller decisions. And I have to say that the usual foundational or guiding principles that help me make decisions aren't there anymore, because it's just me making the decisions that just have to be made. It's tricky. Have you got any advice for me?
I think giving advice to someone I've just met is a dangerous proposition.
I'm never going to meet you again, Adam. Come on. Give me something.
I don't think that's true, Kelly, first of all. Secondly, I think that to give good advice to someone, this is something I've rethought, actually. I used to feel like when somebody asked me for advice, well, they've come to me for a reason, and I'll let them down if I don't give them a recommendation. And now I worry more that I'm doing them a disservice because there's so much I don't know about your new work life. Obviously it took a lot of courage to rethink the journalism career that you were in and say, all right, you know what, I'm going to walk away and I'm going to do this differently. And I think that's something more people should have the bravery to do. But if maybe I could offer a piece of meta advice, it would be that we generally give better advice to others than we take for ourselves. In psychology, this is called Solomon's paradox. And it happens because when we're making our own decisions, we get caught in the weeds and we're focused on the 17 or 24 different factors to weigh. And we build these complex spreadsheets to try to sort through the decision. When we give advice to others, we focus much more on the big picture, the forest rather than the trees. And we'll just say, look, the one or two, or at most three most important considerations in this decision are, and then we have a lot more clarity. And so I think that if I were trying to give you advice, I would say, you know what, Kelly, find someone who who's making similar kinds of decisions to yours and give them some advice on how to navigate those. And then the advice you find yourself giving to others is probably the advice you need to take for yourself.
That's a very clever piece of psychology from you, Adam Grant.
It's the best I can do given the information I have.
That is excellent. Well, congratulations on the book, Think Again. It really, comes at such an important time for us all to be rethinking the way we go about work and life and our expectations of the globe and the people around us. So congratulations. I do love Work Life. It's an excellent podcast for anyone who hasn't discovered it yet. Thank you so much for your time on Curveball.
Thank you for having me. It's been an honor to be here. And I think I counted 3 curveballs during this conversation, which I thoroughly enjoyed.
Curveball's a production of Dead Set Studios, and I made this episode with producer Hannah Kinder and executive producer Rachel Fountain. Please do subscribe to the show. So go into your podcast app, hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we'd also love you to leave a review. It helps other people find the show. We've got some great short episodes coming up. So short, snackable, interesting topics for you, all the things you need to know about being a leader and rethinking in the 21st century. And we also love you to suggest a guest. If there's a leader that you'd love to hear more from, please send me an email. Send it to hello@deadsetstudios.com, or there's a link on our website, curveballshow.com. There's also a Curveball LinkedIn newsletter. So if the podcast is not enough, please do subscribe to the newsletter. There's also a link to that on our website or via the Dead Set Studios Instagram page.